In the summer of 1943, the war had reached a point where every scrap of information could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The Allied forces were preparing for something massive, something that would change the course of history. But they were operating in the dark. The German Panzer divisions had become ghosts, appearing and disappearing across the European theatre with devastating precision. Their movements were unpredictable, their strategies unknown, and their communications encrypted beyond what Allied intelligence could crack in time to matter. But in a small village in occupied France, nestled between rolling hills and endless fields of golden wheat, there lived a man who would become the key to unlocking the greatest intelligence coup of the war. His name was Thomas Hartley, though the locals knew him simply as the American who had forgotten how to leave. Thomas had come to France in 1938, a former engineer from Detroit who had grown tired of the assembly lines and the endless grey of industrial America. He had fallen in love with the French countryside, with its slow pace and simple pleasures, and when the war came, he found himself trapped behind enemy lines, with nothing but his wits and his stubborn refusal to abandon the people who had become his family. If you're enjoying this story of courage and impossible odds, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire was small enough to be forgotten by history, but strategic enough to matter to the German High Command. It sat at a crossroads, a natural convergence point for the roads that connected the German supply lines to the front. And in the summer of '43, it became the temporary headquarters for the 12th Panzer Division, one of the most feared armoured units in the entire German army. Thomas watched from his farmhouse window as the first convoy rolled into town. The rumble of tanks shook the windows in their frames, and the villagers scattered like frightened birds before a storm. He counted the vehicles as they passed, his engineer's mind automatically cataloguing their types and conditions. There were Panzer IV mostly, their long-barreled guns gleaming in the afternoon sun, but he also spotted several of the newer Panthers, their sloped armour a testament to German engineering prowess. The Germans requisitioned the largest buildings in the village for their headquarters. The old chateau that had once belonged to the Beaumont family became the command centre, its elegant halls now filled with maps and radio equipment. The church was converted into a motor pool, its sacred spaces now reeking of diesel fuel and machine oil. And the barn that stood at the edge of Thomas's property was taken over as a communications hub, its thick walls providing natural protection against both the elements and potential airstrikes. It was this last requisition that would prove to be the Germans' fatal mistake. Thomas had lived next to that barn for 5 years. He knew every crack in its walls, every loose board in its floor, every beam in its rafters. He had helped the previous owner, old Henri Dubois, repair it after a storm had torn away half the roof in '41. He knew that barn better than the Germans ever could, and he knew something else too, something that made his heart race with dangerous possibility. There was a crawl space beneath the main floor, a narrow gap between the earth and the wooden planks that had been used for decades to store potatoes and other root vegetables during the winter months. It was barely 2 feet high, cramped and dark and forgotten by everyone except Thomas, who had spent an entire afternoon down there helping Henri retrieve a family of cats that had gotten lost in the space. The idea came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the hills. It was insane, of course. Suicidal, even. But as he watched the German signals officers stringing their communication lines into the barn, as he heard the constant chatter of their radio equipment testing frequencies, Thomas realized that he might be looking at an opportunity that would never come again. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone, and he knew exactly who to contact. Marie Clairefontaine ran the village bakery, a small shop that had somehow managed to stay open even during the occupation. She was a widow in her 40s, her husband having died at Dunkirk in 40, and she carried her grief like armor, using it to deflect the suspicions of the German soldiers who frequented her establishment. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, except a select few, was that Marie-Claire was the local coordinator for the resistance network that operated throughout the region. Thomas approached her 3 days after the Germans arrived, waiting until the shop was empty before speaking in low, urgent French. "I need to get a message to London," he said, his eyes fixed on the window, watching for approaching soldiers. "I have an idea, but I'll need equipment, something I can't get on my own." Marie-Claire's hands never stopped kneading the dough before her, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of equipment?" "A listening device. Something small enough to hide, sensitive enough to pick up conversations from a distance, and I'll need a way to transmit what it captures." She was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "There's a drop coming in 2 weeks, medical supplies officially. I might be able to add something to the manifest. But Thomas, what you're suggesting, if they catch you—" "I know what happens if they catch me," he interrupted. "I've seen what they do to people they suspect of resistance activities. But Marie-Claire, do you understand what's in that barn? They've set up their entire divisional communications hub there. Every order, every movement, every strategic decision the 12th Panzer makes flows through that building. If we can tap into it—" "It could change everything," she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll send the message tonight." The next 2 weeks were an exercise in patience and terror. Thomas went about his daily routine as if nothing had changed, tending his small vegetable garden, repairing the stone wall that bordered his property, nodding politely to the German soldiers who patrolled the village streets. But every night he lay awake in his bed, his mind racing through the details of his plan, looking for flaws, preparing for contingencies. The Germans had established a routine, as military units always do. The communications center operated around the clock, with 3 shifts of signals officers rotating through every 8 hours. The guards changed at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, with a brief overlap period where both shifts were present. The area around the barn was lit by spotlights at night, but there was a gap in the coverage on the western side where the light from the nearest lamp was blocked by a large oak tree. Thomas mapped every detail, committing it to memory. He timed the guards' patrols, noting that they passed the western corner of the barn every 12 minutes like clockwork. He observed the signals officers during their shift changes, watching how they gathered outside to smoke and talk, distracted and vulnerable. He studied the terrain, identifying the best approach routes and escape paths, and every day he walked past the haystack that stood just 30 yards from the barn's entrance. It was a massive thing, that haystack, built up over the previous summer's harvest. The Germans had considered moving it when they first arrived, concerned that it might provide cover for saboteurs, but in the end they had decided it wasn't worth the effort. It was just hay, after all. What possible threat could it pose? Thomas had different ideas. The drop came on a moonless night in late July. Thomas was waiting in the designated field, hidden among the tall grass, when he heard the distant drone of the aircraft. Moments later, a parachute bloomed in the darkness, drifting silently toward the earth. He retrieved the canister before it had been on the ground for 30 seconds, dragging it into the cover of a nearby hedgerow. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath packages of morphine and bandages, he found what he had asked for. The listening device was smaller than he had expected, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, with a tiny microphone that could be extended on a flexible wire. There was also a compact radio transmitter, its components carefully packed in protective foam, along with a codebook and a schedule of transmission times. And there was a note, handwritten in English. "Good luck. Churchill is watching. M." Thomas spent the next 3 nights preparing. He assembled the transmitter in his root cellar, testing its range and adjusting its frequency to match the schedule he had been given. He practiced disassembling and reassembling the listening device until he could do it in complete darkness by feel alone. He memorized the codes, burning the book page by page in his kitchen stove. On the fourth night, he made his move. The summer heat had been relentless, and even after midnight the air was thick and warm. Thomas moved through the darkness like a ghost, his body pressed low to the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. He had blackened his face with soot and wore dark clothing that blended with the shadows. In his pocket, wrapped in cloth to prevent any noise, was the listening device. He reached the haystack without incident, slipping into its shadow and pausing to let his breathing steady. From here, he could see the entrance to the barn, could hear the muffled sounds of the radio equipment inside, the occasional burst of static, the rapid fire of Morse code. 2 guards stood by the door, their cigarettes glowing in the darkness like fireflies. Thomas had planned this moment for weeks. The haystack was close enough to the barn that the listening device's microphone would be able to pick up conversations from inside, especially when the doors were opened during shift changes. But hiding the device in the hay itself wasn't enough. He needed to position it carefully, angle it correctly, and ensure it would remain hidden even if the Germans decided to search the area. He had designed a solution worthy of his engineering background. Using materials he had scavenged from his farm, a length of copper wire, a small wooden box, some waterproof canvas, he had created a housing for the device that could be buried deep within the haystack, while still allowing the microphone to extend toward the barn. The wire would act as an antenna, boosting the device's transmission range, while the canvas would protect it from moisture. Working in absolute silence, Thomas began to burrow into the haystack. The dry stalks whispered against his clothing, and he froze every few seconds, listening for any sign that the guards had heard. But the night remained quiet, and slowly, inch by inch, he pushed deeper into the mass of dried grass. It took him almost an hour to position the device properly. His arms ached from the awkward angle, and bits of hay had worked their way into his clothing, scratching against his skin. But finally, he felt the microphone slip into place, its flexible wire extending through a carefully constructed channel toward the barn wall. He backed out of the haystack even more slowly than he had entered, rearranging the disturbed hay as he went. When he finally emerged into the night air, his body was trembling with exhaustion and fear. He lay flat on the ground for a long moment, watching the guards, making sure they hadn't noticed anything amiss. They hadn't. They were still smoking, still talking in low voices about home and food and women, completely unaware that their entire operation had just been compromised. Thomas made it back to his farmhouse as the first grey light of dawn was beginning to appear on the eastern horizon. He collapsed into his bed without even removing his dirty clothes, his heart still pounding with adrenaline. But even as exhaustion pulled him towards sleep, a fierce smile crossed his face. He had done it. The bug was in place. Now came the truly dangerous part. The first transmission went out the following night at exactly 2:37 in the morning, according to the schedule he had been given. Thomas huddled in his root cellar, the transmitter's glow casting strange shadows on the earthen walls, his fingers moving carefully over the Morse key. The message was brief, just a test signal to confirm that the device was operational. But even those few seconds of transmission felt like an eternity, each dot and dash seeming to echo through the night like a thunderclap. When he finally signed off and switched off the transmitter, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely fold the antenna. The response came 2 nights later, buried in a BBC broadcast that Thomas listened to on his hidden radio. It was coded, of course, disguised as a message to a farmer in Kent about the health of his prize-winning pig. But Thomas recognized the pattern, the confirmation code he had been given. London had received his signal. The operation was a go. Over the following weeks, Thomas fell into a routine that was as dangerous as it was productive. Every few days, he would retrieve the recordings from his listening device, using the cover of his normal farm activities to approach the haystack without arousing suspicion. He would tend his vegetable garden, check on the apple trees that grew along the edge of his property, and in the process would brush against the haystack, his fingers finding the hidden compartment where the device stored its captured intelligence. The information that flowed through that little machine was staggering. Thomas heard planning sessions for upcoming operations, discussions of supply routes and fuel reserves, arguments about strategy and tactics. He heard the names of unit commanders and the designations of their forces. He heard complaints about equipment failures and personnel shortages, intelligence gold that revealed the true state of the German war machine. And he heard something else, something that made his blood run cold. It was early August when the conversation occurred. Thomas was transcribing one of his captured recordings, his headphones pressed tight against his ears, when he heard a voice he didn't recognize, a voice that carried the clipped accent and arrogant tone of a high-ranking officer. "The Führer has approved the transfer," the voice said. "The 12th Panzer will be moved to reinforce the Atlantic Wall. We expect the invasion to come at Pas-de-Calais, and we must be ready to push them back into the sea." Another voice responded, one that Thomas had learned to recognize as belonging to Colonel Friedrich Müller, the commander of the 12th Panzer Division. "When do we move?" "September 1st. You will have 3 weeks to prepare. I want every tank, every truck, every man ready to roll the moment the order comes." Thomas sat back, his mind reeling. The Atlantic Wall, Pas-de-Calais. The Germans were preparing for an Allied invasion, but they were preparing in the wrong place. He had heard rumors, whispers pass through the resistance network, that the real invasion would come somewhere else, somewhere the Germans weren't expecting. If he could get this information to London, if the Allies knew exactly where the German reserves were being positioned, they could exploit the gap. They could land their forces where the defenses were weakest and establish a beachhead before the panzers could respond. This wasn't just valuable intelligence. This was the kind of information that could win the war. Thomas transmitted his longest message yet that night, encoding the details of what he had heard using the cipher he had been given. His fingers flew over the Morse key, the rhythm becoming almost musical as he poured out the secrets he had stolen from the enemy. When he finished, he sat in the darkness of his root cellar, listening to the silence of the night. He had just sent information that could change the course of history. He had just painted a target on his back that would never go away, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would do it again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night for as long as the opportunity lasted, because this was why he had stayed. This was why he had risked everything. Not for glory or recognition, but for the simple, stubborn belief that one person in the right place at the right time could make a difference. The Germans suspected nothing. Or at least that's what Thomas believed. But even as he continued his dangerous work, forces were aligning against him that he couldn't see, couldn't anticipate. The German counterintelligence services had noticed the pattern of Allied operations that seemed to anticipate their moves with uncanny accuracy. They had begun to suspect that there was a leak somewhere in the communications chain, and they were getting closer to finding it with every passing day. The first sign of trouble came in mid-August, when Thomas noticed a new face among the soldiers who patrolled the village. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and an SS uniform, and he spent his time watching, always watching, his gaze lingering on the villagers with the cold attention of a predator. Marie-Claire identified him 3 days later. "His name is Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He's from the Gestapo. They've sent him to investigate a possible intelligence leak." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Do they know where the leak is? Not yet, but he's questioning everyone, Thomas. The signals officers, the guards, the villagers. Sooner or later, someone will say something, notice something. It's only a matter of time. Then we need to accelerate the timeline, Thomas said, his mind racing. How much longer can the resistance support the operation? London wants to keep it running as long as possible. The intelligence you're providing is invaluable. They're using it to plan something big, Thomas, something that could end the war. It won't matter if I'm captured and the device is found. Weber will trace the communications, roll up the entire network. You, me, everyone who's helped us. Marie Claire was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded, her face set with determination. I'll send word tonight. We need an extraction plan. But extraction plans take time to arrange, and time was something Thomas no longer had. Weber's investigation was methodical, relentless. He interrogated the signals officers for hours, probing for any breach in protocol, any suspicious behavior. He searched the barn from top to bottom, though he never thought to look in the haystack outside. He questioned the villagers about the American who lived at the edge of town, the man who had been here since before the war. Thomas felt the noose tightening around his neck. He continued his transmissions, each one more urgent than the last, but he knew he was running out of time. The question wasn't whether Weber would find him, but when. The break came on a Thursday afternoon, during one of the hottest days of the summer. Thomas was in his garden, pretending to tend his tomatoes, when he saw Weber walking toward his property. The Gestapo officer moved with purposeful strides, his SS uniform impeccable despite the heat, and behind him walked two soldiers carrying rifles. Thomas's first instinct was to run. He knew the woods behind his property, knew a dozen hiding places where he could disappear until nightfall. But running would confirm Weber's suspicions, would bring the full weight of the German security apparatus down on the village. So instead, he stood his ground, wiping his hands on his trousers as Weber approached. Herr Hartley, Weber said, his French heavily accented but precise. I have some questions for you. Thomas nodded, forcing his face into an expression of mild curiosity. Of course, Hauptsturmführer. How can I help? You have lived in this village for how long? 5 years, more or less. I came for the wine and stayed for the women. Thomas attempted a smile, but Weber's expression didn't change. And during the occupation, you have remained here. Why? Where would I go? The borders are closed. The ports are watched. Besides, this is my home now. I have friends here, a life. The war won't last forever. Weber's eyes narrowed. You are American, yes? Your country is at war with the Reich. Some might consider it suspicious that you have been allowed to remain here, living so close to a military installation. I've been nothing but cooperative with the authorities, Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. I've followed every regulation, reported every visitor, done everything that's been asked of me. If there's a problem with my presence, I'm sure Colonel Müller would have informed me by now. It was a calculated gamble, invoking the Panzer commander's name. Weber's mission was to find a leak, not to antagonize the Wehrmacht officers whose cooperation he needed. But the gamble paid off. Weber's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance, and he stepped back. We will be watching you, Herr Hartley, very closely. Thomas watched him go, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He had bought himself some time, but how much? Days, hours. Weber was suspicious, and suspicious men dig until they find what they're looking for. That night, Thomas sent an emergency transmission. The message was brief, just 4 words. Compromised, need extraction, now. The response came faster than he had expected. By the following evening, Marie Claire had received instructions through the resistance network. A plane would be sent in 3 nights, landing in a field 10 kilometers north of the village. Thomas would need to make his way there on foot. avoiding the German patrols that crisscrossed the countryside. But there was a complication. "London wants one more transmission before you go," Marie-Claire said, her voice heavy with reluctance. "They need confirmation of the Panzer Division's departure date. The invasion planning depends on it." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the request settle on his shoulders. One more transmission, one more trip to retrieve the recordings from the haystack, one more night of dancing on the edge of a knife. When do they need it? Tomorrow night. The plane can't wait any longer than that. Tomorrow night, less than 48 hours before his extraction. He would have to retrieve the recordings during the day, when his movements would be visible to anyone watching. He would have to encode and transmit the information while Weber's men were actively searching for the source of the leak. And then he would have to slip out of the village and travel 10 kilometers through enemy territory without being caught. It was impossible. It was suicide, and it was exactly what he had signed up for. "Tell London I'll get them what they need," he said. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, a welcome change from the relentless summer heat. Thomas went about his routine as if nothing had changed, feeding his chickens, watering his garden, nodding to the German soldiers who passed on patrol. But his eyes kept drifting to the haystack, calculating the best moment to make his approach. He waited until noon, when the guards changed shifts and the soldiers gathered outside the barn for their lunch break. Under the pretense of checking on his apple trees, which grew along the property line just meters from the haystack, Thomas made his move. His hands were steady as he reached into the hidden compartment, his fingers finding the device by memory alone. The recording cylinder was nearly full, days of captured conversations compressed into a few inches of wire. He palmed it smoothly, slipping it into his pocket without breaking stride, and continued his leisurely inspection of the apple trees. It was only when he glanced toward the barn that he saw Weber watching him. The Gestapo officer was standing in the doorway, a cigarette in his hand, his eyes fixed on Thomas with predatory intensity. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Weber smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes, and turned away. Thomas forced himself to walk at a normal pace back to his farmhouse. His mind was racing, trying to interpret what had just happened. Had Weber seen him reach into the haystack? Had he noticed the cylinder being transferred? Or was he simply watching, waiting for Thomas to make a mistake that would confirm his suspicions? There was no way to know. All Thomas could do was press forward and hope that his luck held for one more day. He spent the afternoon transcribing the recordings, his headphones pressed tight against his ears, his pencil flying across the paper as he captured every relevant detail. The intelligence was exactly what London had requested. The 12th Panzer Division would begin its movement on September 1st, traveling by rail to the Pas-de-Calais region. The journey would take 3 days, during which the unit would be vulnerable, strung out along hundreds of kilometers of track. But there was more. In one of the later recordings, Thomas heard Colonel Müller discussing something that made his blood run cold. "The Führer has authorized the deployment of the new Tigers," Müller said. 20 of them, fresh from the factory. They'll join us at Calais in time for the expected invasion. Tiger tanks. The most feared armored vehicles in the German arsenal, with armor so thick that Allied shells bounced off like pebbles. 20 of them could turn the tide of any battle, could slaughter infantry and destroy Allied tanks with impunity. If they reached the invasion beaches, Thomas added the information to his transmission, encoding it carefully according to his cipher. When he finally powered up the transmitter that night, hiding in his root cellar with the door barred and blankets hung over the windows to muffle any sound, his message was the longest he had ever sent. The transmission took almost 20 minutes, 20 minutes of exposure, 20 minutes during which any German direction-finding equipment in the area could triangulate his position. Thomas's hands were cramping by the time he finished, his fingers slick with sweat despite the cool air of the cellar. But he had done it. The information was on its way to London. Now all he had to do was survive until the extraction. He destroyed the transmitter that night, breaking it down into its component parts and scattering them across his property. The cipher book had already been burned, the recording cylinders crushed and buried. By the time he finished, there was nothing left that could connect him to the intelligence operation, nothing except the device still hidden in the haystack. He couldn't retrieve it. Not now, with Weber watching his every move. It would have to stay where it was, buried in the hay, waiting to be discovered or to rot away with the passing seasons. Thomas felt a pang of regret at abandoning the little machine that had served him so well, but there was no choice. His survival depended on leaving no trace. The night of the extraction arrived with a steady rain that turned the roads to mud and reduced visibility to a few dozen meters. Thomas slipped out of his farmhouse at midnight, dressed in dark clothing and carrying nothing but a small pack with water and emergency supplies. He had memorized the route to the extraction point. Every turn and landmark burned into his brain. He made it almost a kilometer before he realized he was being followed. The sound was subtle, just a whisper of movement in the darkness behind him, but Thomas had spent months living on the edge of disaster. His senses were tuned to detect the slightest threat, and every instinct was screaming at him now. He ducked into a hedgerow, pressing himself flat against the wet earth, and waited. Minutes passed. The rain continued to fall, pattering against the leaves above him, masking any sounds of pursuit. Thomas began to wonder if he had imagined the threat, if his paranoia had finally gotten the better of him. Then a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the field just meters from where he lay. "He came this way," a voice said in German. "The tracks are fresh." Weber's voice responded, cold and satisfied. "Spread out. He can't have gone far." Thomas's heart was pounding so hard he was certain they could hear it. He had two choices: stay hidden and hope they passed him by, or run and try to reach the extraction point before they caught him. Both options seemed equally suicidal. He chose to run. Bursting from the hedgerow, Thomas sprinted across the open field, his feet slipping in the mud, his lungs burning with the effort. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm, the crack of rifle fire, the whistle of bullets passing too close for comfort. He ran as he had never run before, fueled by pure adrenaline and the desperate will to survive. The night was a blur of darkness and rain and the pounding of his own heart. He lost track of direction, of time, of everything except the need to keep moving, to put distance between himself and his pursuers. It was almost dawn when he finally collapsed, his body giving out in a copse of trees on the edge of a farmer's field. He lay there gasping, his clothes soaked and muddy, every muscle screaming in protest. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but he knew it was only temporary. Weber would have called in reinforcements by now, would have alerted every patrol in the region. The entire countryside would be searching for him, but he was still alive, and if he was alive, there was still hope. Thomas forced himself to his feet, orienting by the grey light of dawn. The extraction point was still several kilometers away, and the plane wouldn't wait. He had perhaps 2 hours to cover the distance, evade the German patrols, and reach the field where his salvation waited. He started walking. The journey that followed was a nightmare of close calls and narrow escapes. Twice he had to hide in ditches as German patrols passed within meters of his position. Once he stumbled directly into a checkpoint, managing to slip away in the confusion, only because the guards were more interested in their breakfast than in watching the road. But somehow, impossibly, he made it. The field was exactly where it was supposed to be, a flat expanse of grass bordered by trees on 3 sides. And there, silhouetted against the morning sky, was the most beautiful sight Thomas had ever seen. A Lysander aircraft, its engine idling, its pilot waving frantically for him to hurry. Thomas ran, His legs were rubber, his lungs were on fire, but he ran with everything he had left. The pilot was shouting something, pointing behind Thomas, and he risked a glance over his shoulder. Weber was there, emerging from the trees at the edge of the field, his pistol raised. The shot rang out just as Thomas reached the aircraft. He felt a burning pain in his side, a sensation like being punched by a giant fist, but he didn't stop. Hands reached down to grab him, hauling him into the cramped rear compartment, and then the engine roared and the ground fell away beneath them. Thomas lay on the floor of the aircraft, staring up at the grey sky through the canopy, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. Blood was seeping through his fingers, but he was smiling. He had done it. Against all odds, against every expectation, he had done it. The intelligence he had gathered would change the course of the war. The Allied planners would know exactly where the German reserves were positioned, exactly when they would move, exactly what equipment they would bring. When the invasion finally came, not at Pas-de-Calais but at Normandy, the Panzer divisions would be in the wrong place, their tigers rolling uselessly toward a threat that didn't exist. Thousands of soldiers would live because of what Thomas had done. The war would be shortened by months, perhaps years, and it had all started with a desperate idea, a hidden device, and a haystack. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hold on back there! We've got a medical team waiting in England. You're going to be fine." Thomas closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion finally claim him. He thought about the village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire, about Marie-Claire and the brave men and women of the resistance who had risked everything to support his mission. He thought about the little device still hidden in the haystack, its secrets already transmitted, its purpose fulfilled. And he thought about Weber, standing in that field with his pistol raised, watching his quarry escape. There would be repercussions, of course. The Germans would tear the village apart looking for answers. Marie-Claire would have to go underground. The resistance network would scatter and reform. But they had known the risks from the beginning, had accepted them willingly in the name of something greater than themselves. The plane banked toward the coast, leaving occupied France behind. Below, the countryside rolled by in a patchwork of fields and forests, beautiful even in wartime, worth fighting for, worth dying for. Thomas Hartley, the tough American who had refused to leave, was going home. But his war wasn't over. Not yet, because even as he flew toward safety, he was already thinking about what came next, about how he could use what he had learned to help end this conflict once and for all. The story of the bug in the haystack would become legend in the intelligence community, whispered about in training sessions and strategy meetings for decades to come. But for Thomas, it was never about glory or recognition. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. 3 months later, Thomas stood in a briefing room deep beneath the streets of London. His wound had healed, leaving only a puckered scar on his left side, a permanent reminder of his escape from occupied France. Around him sat some of the most powerful military minds in the Allied forces, generals and admirals and intelligence chiefs who had been fighting this war since its earliest days. At the head of the table sat a man whose face was known throughout the world, a man whose cigar smoke filled the room with its distinctive aroma. Winston Churchill studied Thomas with keen eyes, taking in every detail of the unassuming American who had accomplished what some had thought impossible. "Mr. Hartley," Churchill said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "I've read your reports. Remarkable work. Truly remarkable." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the Prime Minister's attention. "I just did what anyone would have done in my position, sir." "That is manifestly untrue, and we both know it. What you did required extraordinary courage, exceptional intelligence, and a particular kind of stubbornness that I find personally admirable." Churchill's eyes twinkled with something that might have been humor. "The intelligence you provided has proven invaluable. Our planning staff estimates that your information will save countless lives when the invasion begins. When will that be, sir? The invasion? The room fell silent. Eyes flickered to Churchill, who took a long draw on his cigar before responding. Soon, Mr. Hartley, sooner than our enemies expect, and when it comes, we will be ready, in large part because of what you accomplished in that French village. Thomas nodded, feeling a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what he had achieved, sadness for those who had been left behind, for the friends he might never see again. There is one more thing, Churchill continued. We find ourselves in need of men with your particular talents. The war is far from over, and there are operations being planned that require individuals who can operate behind enemy lines, who can think on their feet, who can survive in impossible situations. You're asking me to go back. I'm asking if you would consider it. No pressure, of course. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect, but if you're willing. Thomas thought about the village, about the hay fields and the apple trees, and the quiet evenings watching the sun set over the Loire Valley. He thought about Marie-Claire and the others, still fighting, still risking everything for freedom. He thought about what he had seen in the eyes of the German soldiers, the mix of arrogance and fear that characterized an empire on the edge of collapse. Tell me about the operation, he said. Churchill smiled, a broad, genuine expression that transformed his bulldog features. General Eisenhower, if you would. A tall American officer stood, moving to a map that covered the entire wall behind him. The map showed the coast of France, but not the area Thomas knew. This was further north, a stretch of beaches with code names that meant nothing to him yet, but would soon become seared into the memory of the world. Operation Overlord, Eisenhower said. The largest amphibious invasion in history. We're going to hit them where they least expect it, and we're going to break the back of the Nazi war machine once and for all. Thomas listened as the general outlined the plan, feeling a mixture of awe and terror at its audacity. 5 beaches, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. It was madness on a scale he could barely comprehend, and yet, as Eisenhower spoke, it began to seem not just possible, but inevitable. We need intelligence on the beach defenses, Eisenhower continued. Detailed, accurate intelligence that our aerial reconnaissance can't provide. We need to know about minefields, bunker positions, troop concentrations, and we need men who can get in, gather the information, and get out without being detected. That's where you come in, Mr. Hartley, Churchill added, if you're willing. Thomas looked at the map, at the beaches with their innocent code names, Utah and Omaha, Gold and Juno and Sword. He thought about the men who would storm those beaches, young men from America and Britain and Canada and a dozen other countries who would wade through surf and sand and blood to liberate a continent. I'm willing, he said. The weeks that followed were a blur of training and preparation. Thomas learned new skills, new techniques for gathering intelligence and avoiding capture. He worked with other agents, men and women who had their own stories of courage and sacrifice, who had survived their own impossible missions behind enemy lines. And he learned about the French resistance, about the networks of brave men and women who were laying the groundwork for the invasion, sabotaging German operations, gathering intelligence, preparing to rise up when the moment came. Marie-Claire was among them. She had escaped Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire just days after Thomas's departure, slipping through the German dragnet with the help of contacts in the Underground Railroad. She was now operating in Normandy, coordinating resistance activities in the very area where the invasion would land. I want to work with her network, Thomas told his handlers. She knows the terrain, knows the people. With her help, we can get the intelligence you need. It wasn't an easy sell. The operation was too important to risk on personal connections, they argued, but Thomas was persistent, and eventually they agreed. He parachuted into France on a night in late May, landing in a field that could have been the twin of the one where he had made his escape months earlier. Marie-Claire was waiting for him, her face older, harder, but her eyes still burning with the same fierce determination he remembered. "Welcome back," she said, embracing him briefly before stepping back to business. "We have work to do." The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Thomas's life. Working with Marie-Claire and her network, he mapped the German defences along the Normandy coast, identifying weak points and strongholds, troop concentrations and artillery positions. He infiltrated German installations, posed as a local farmhand, gathered information through a dozen different channels. And through it all, he thought about the men who would soon be storming those beaches, about the intelligence he was gathering that might mean the difference between life and death for thousands of soldiers. The night before the invasion, Thomas stood on a cliff overlooking the English Channel, watching the distant horizon where he knew the greatest armada ever assembled was gathering. The sky was overcast, the wind was picking up, and there were rumors that the operation might be delayed due to bad weather. Marie-Claire joined him, her face illuminated by the glow of a forbidden cigarette. "They're really going to do it," she said. "After all these years, they're finally coming." Thomas nodded. "Everything we've done, everything we've sacrificed, it all comes down to this. Are you scared?" He considered the question honestly, terrified, but also hopeful. "For the first time in years, I actually believe we might win this thing." "We will win," Marie-Claire said, with a certainty that brooked no argument. "We have to. Too many people have given too much for any other outcome." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below. Then Marie-Claire dropped her cigarette and ground it out beneath her heel. "Come, we have one more mission before the dawn." The mission was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Thomas and Marie-Claire needed to disable a German radar station that would otherwise detect the approaching invasion fleet. The station was heavily guarded, but they had inside help. A German soldier who had grown disillusioned with the Nazi cause and was willing to risk everything to see it fall. They approached the station just after midnight, crawling through the tall grass that surrounded the facility. The guards were alert, their nerves jangled by the increased activity they had noticed in recent days, but they weren't prepared for what came next. The inside man opened a gate in the perimeter fence, allowing Thomas and Marie-Claire to slip through undetected. They moved through the facility like shadows, disabling guards with quiet efficiency, making their way toward the radar equipment at the heart of the complex. Thomas had trained for this moment, had practiced the sabotage techniques until he could perform them in his sleep. Working quickly, he planted charges on the critical components, setting the timers for 15 minutes, enough time for them to get clear before the explosions drew every German soldier in the region. They were almost out when the alarm sounded. Someone had found one of the disabled guards. The facility erupted in chaos, soldiers running in every direction, searchlights sweeping across the compound. Thomas and Marie-Claire flattened themselves against a wall, watching as a patrol passed within meters of their position. "The fence," Marie-Claire whispered. "We need to reach the fence." They ran, abandoning stealth for speed, trusting in the confusion to cover their escape. Bullets whined past them, close enough that Thomas could feel the wind of their passage, but somehow, impossibly, none of them found their mark. They hit the fence just as the charges detonated. The explosion lit up the night, a massive fireball that consumed the radar station and sent a pillar of smoke rising into the sky. The shockwave knocked Thomas off his feet, and he landed hard on the other side of the fence, the breath driven from his lungs. Marie-Claire pulled him up, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "Move, they'll be coming." They ran into the darkness, leaving the burning station behind them. And as they ran, Thomas heard something that made his heart soar. The drone of aircraft engines, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, filling the sky with their thunder. He looked up and saw the shadows of planes passing overhead, towing gliders full of paratroopers heading toward the drop zones they had helped identify. The invasion had begun. Dawn came slowly that day, filtered through clouds and smoke and the dust of battle. Thomas and Marie-Claire had made their way to a safe house in the countryside, where they huddled around a radio, listening to the reports that crackled through the static. The landings were underway. Allied forces were storming the beaches, fighting their way through the German defenses. There were heavy casualties, especially on Omaha Beach, where the defenders had been stronger than expected. But the beachheads were being established. The liberation of Europe had begun. Thomas listened to the reports with tears streaming down his face. He thought about all the intelligence he had gathered, all the information that had helped the planners understand what they were facing. He thought about the raid on the radar station, which had blinded the Germans to the approaching fleet until it was too late. And he thought about the bug in the haystack, the little device that had started it all, that had given the Allies their first glimpse into the enemy's plans. It had been worth it, all of it, every moment of fear, every brush with death, every sacrifice. It had all been worth it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The Allied forces pushed inland, supported by the resistance networks that rose up across France. Thomas and Marie-Claire worked with the advancing troops, providing intelligence, identifying collaborators, helping to coordinate the liberation of town after town. And then, almost before Thomas could comprehend it, he was standing in the streets of Paris. The city was free. After 4 years of occupation, the German flag no longer flew from the Eiffel Tower. French citizens danced in the streets, embracing the American and British and Canadian soldiers who had come to liberate them. It was a moment of pure, unalloyed joy, a celebration of everything they had fought for. Thomas found a quiet corner in a cafe near the Seine, nursing a glass of wine that some generous soul had pressed into his hand. The noise of the celebration washed over him like a wave, but he felt strangely detached from it, as if he were watching from a great distance. Marie-Claire found him there, her face glowing with happiness, but her eyes understanding. "It's hard, isn't it?" she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "After everything we've been through, to suddenly have it be over." "Is it over?" Thomas asked. "The war, I mean. The Germans are retreating, but they're not beaten. There's still fighting to be done." "The war will end," Marie-Claire said with certainty. "Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. And when it does, we'll have to figure out how to live in a world at peace. That might be the hardest battle of all." Thomas thought about her words as the celebration continued around them. She was right, of course. The skills he had developed, the instincts he had honed, they were suited for war, for danger, for survival against impossible odds. What would he do with them when there was no enemy to fight? But that was a problem for another day. For now, there was wine to drink and friends to celebrate with, and a world that had been saved from darkness. He raised his glass to Marie-Claire. "To the future," he said, "whatever it holds." She clinked her glass against his. To the future. The war ended 8 months later, with the German surrender in May of 1945. Thomas was in London when the news came, working with the intelligence services to help process the flood of information that was emerging from the collapsed Nazi regime. He heard the church bells ringing, saw the crowds gathering in the streets, felt the wave of relief and joy that swept across the city. But his work wasn't done. There were war criminals to track down, stolen treasures to recover, displaced persons to help. And there was the matter of what came next, the shape of the post-war world that was beginning to emerge from the ruins of the conflict. Thomas stayed in Europe for another 2 years, working with various agencies to tie up the loose ends of the war. He testified at trials, provided evidence against Nazi officials who had committed atrocities, helped to reunite families that had been torn apart by the conflict. And then, finally, he went home. Detroit had changed in the years he had been away, grown and evolved in ways he hadn't expected. The factories that had once produced automobiles were now producing refrigerators and washing machines, tools for a new era of prosperity. The streets were filled with young men who had survived the war, building lives for themselves, starting families, chasing the American dream. Thomas felt like a stranger in his own country. The skills that had kept him alive in occupied France were useless here. The instincts that had served him so well now a source of constant low-grade anxiety. He jumped at sudden noises, scanned crowds for threats that didn't exist, woke in the night with his heart pounding from dreams he couldn't quite remember. But slowly, gradually, he began to heal. He got a job at one of the factories, using his engineering skills to help design the new generation of consumer products that America was hungry for. He made friends, joined a bowling league, learned to relax in ways that had been impossible during the war years. And he met someone. Her name was Eleanor, and she worked in the office at the factory, handling payroll and personnel matters. She was smart and kind and had a laugh that could light up a room. She didn't know anything about Thomas's past, about the missions and the danger and the lives he had saved. To her, he was just another veteran trying to make his way in the post-war world. They married in the spring of 1948, in a small ceremony attended by family and friends. Thomas had invited Marie-Claire, who had returned to France after the war, to help rebuild her country, but she couldn't make the trip. She sent a telegram instead, 3 words that made Thomas smile through his tears. Finally, be happy. The years that followed were good ones. Thomas and Eleanor had children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up hearing sanitized versions of their father's wartime adventures. They lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs, with a garden that Thomas tended with the same care he had once given to his surveillance operations. But the war never truly left him. Some nights he would wake in the darkness, his mind filled with images of HAYSTACK and searchlights and the cold eyes of a Gestapo officer. He would slip out of bed, careful not to wake Eleanor, and sit in his study, staring at the medals that hung on the wall, tokens of a life that sometimes seemed to belong to someone else. It was during one of these nights that he received a letter from England. The letter was from the British government, informing him that he had been nominated for the Distinguished Service Order, one of the highest honours that could be bestowed on a foreign national. The citation praised his exceptional courage and resourcefulness during operations in occupied France, noting specifically his role in gathering intelligence that had contributed significantly to the success of Operation Overlord. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Then he folded it carefully and put it away in a drawer, where it would remain unseen for years. He never told Eleanor about the letter, or about the ceremony in London where he received the medal, standing among other veterans who had risked everything for freedom. Some secrets, he had learned, were meant to be kept. The years turned into decades. The children grew up and moved away, starting families of their own. Eleanor's hair turned grey, then white, and Thomas's face lined with the marks of age and experience. They grew old together, surrounded by grandchildren who climbed on Thomas's knee and begged for stories about the old days. He never told them about the bug in the haystack. It wasn't until 1984, almost 40 years after the war's end, that the story finally came out. A historian working on a book about wartime intelligence operations had discovered a reference to Thomas's mission in declassified British documents. He tracked Thomas down, now 80 years old and living in a retirement community in Florida, and asked if he would be willing to be interviewed. Thomas agreed, though not without reservations. For 4 decades, he had kept his secrets, shared them only with Eleanor and a handful of others who had been there. But the world had changed. The Cold War had taught people the value of intelligence operations, and perhaps it was time for the story to be told. The interview lasted 3 days. Thomas spoke about everything: the recruitment, the training, the long months of gathering intelligence from the communications hub that the Germans had unwittingly established next to his property. He spoke about the fear and the loneliness and the constant awareness that discovery meant death, and he spoke about the people who had helped him, Marie-Claire and the resistance fighters and the countless unknown souls who had risked everything for freedom. When the book was published, it became a sensation. Thomas received letters from around the world, from veterans who had stormed the beaches at Normandy and wanted to thank the man whose intelligence had helped them survive, from historians who had questions about specific details, from ordinary people who had been moved by his story. But the letter that meant the most came from France. It was from Marie-Claire's daughter, Isabelle. Marie-Claire had passed away 5 years earlier, but before she died, she had told Isabelle about the American who had come to their village, who had hidden a listening device in a haystack and stolen the secrets of an entire Panzer division. She had spoken of his courage, his determination, his absolute refusal to give up even when the odds were impossible. "My mother never forgot you," Isabelle wrote. "She said you were the bravest man she ever knew. And she wanted me to tell you, if I ever had the chance, that what you did mattered. It mattered more than you will ever know." Thomas read the letter through tears that he couldn't stop, that he didn't want to stop. He thought about Marie-Claire, about her fierce determination and her unshakable faith in the cause they were fighting for. He thought about all the others who had helped him, who had risked their lives to support his mission, many of whom he would never know. And he thought about the haystack. It was probably gone now, rotted away or cleared to make room for new construction. The barn that had housed the German communications hub had been demolished years ago, replaced by a modern building that served some mundane purpose. The village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire had moved on, its wartime history remembered only by the oldest residents and the occasional tourist who came to see the memorial plaque that had been erected in the village square. But the impact of what had happened there, the intelligence that had flowed through that hidden device, the decisions that had been shaped by what Thomas had learned, that would echo through history forever. Thomas Hartley died on a quiet morning in the spring of 1987, surrounded by his family. He was 83 years old, and he had lived a life that would have seemed impossible to the young engineer who had first arrived in France in 1938. At his funeral, his grandson, now a young man studying history at Yale, read a passage that Thomas had selected years earlier, words that had always resonated with him. "In the end, what matters is not the great sweep of history, but the individual acts of courage and sacrifice that make that history possible. One person, in the right place, at the right time, can change the world." The mourners filed past the casket, paying their respects to a man who had embodied those words in ways that most of them would never fully understand. Among them was an elderly woman who had flown in from France, her face lined with age, but her eyes still bright with intelligence. Isabelle Fontaine had made the journey to pay her mother's respects as well as her own. She placed a small object on the casket, a piece of copper wire twisted into the shape of a heart, and whispered words that only Thomas would have understood. "Merci, mon ami. Pour tout. Thank you, my friend, for everything." The legacy of the bug in the haystack lived on long after Thomas's death. The techniques he had pioneered, the lessons learned from his operation, became part of the training curriculum for intelligence agencies around the world. Historians continued to study the impact of his intelligence on the outcome of the war, debating exactly how many lives had been saved, how many battles had been won because of what he had learned. But beyond the strategic calculations and the historical assessments, there was a simpler legacy, a story of one man who had refused to be a bystander, who had seen an opportunity to make a difference and had seized it with both hands. In an age of mass movements, and world-spanning conflicts, Thomas Hartley had proven that individual courage still mattered, that one person, armed with nothing but ingenuity and determination, could change the course of history. The haystack was long gone, but the legend endured. And somewhere, in the archives of intelligence agencies and the memories of those who had known him, the tough guy who had hidden a bug in a haystack and stolen the secrets of an entire Panzer division was remembered. Not as a hero, though he was certainly that, but as a man who had done what needed to be done, no matter the cost. That, in the end, was the truest measure of his life. And as the sun set over the cemetery where Thomas Hartley lay at rest, as his family gathered to share memories and shed tears, the world continued to turn, shaped in ways both seen and unseen by the courage of those who had come before. The war was over. The peace had been won. And the story of the bug in the haystack would be told for generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest times, one person could make all the difference. This was the legacy of Thomas Hartley. This was the truth of history. And this was the end of one story and the beginning of countless others that would follow. For in the end, the greatest intelligence of all is not the secrets we steal or the codes we break, but the understanding that courage, in all its forms, is the most powerful weapon of all. Thomas knew this. Marie-Claire knew this, and now, perhaps, so do you. The tough guy who hid a bug in a haystack didn't just steal intel from a Panzer division. He helped steal victory from the jaws of defeat, and in doing so, he showed the world what one person, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, could accomplish. That is a story worth remembering. That is a legacy worth honoring. And that, dear viewer, is why history matters. Because in the stories of those who came before us, we find the courage to face whatever challenges lie ahead. Thank you for watching. And remember, you too have the power to make a difference. All it takes is the courage to try. Years after Thomas's passing, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell decided to visit Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire. She had read the book about Thomas's exploits, had been moved by his story, and felt compelled to see the place where it had all happened. The village had changed, of course. Modern buildings stood where rubble had once lain. New roads carved through the landscape. But some things remained, echoes of the past that refused to fade. Sarah found the spot where Thomas's farmhouse had stood. It was a bed and breakfast now, run by a friendly couple who had no idea of the history that had unfolded on their property. She walked the fields, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live in fear, to carry secrets that could mean death if discovered, and she found the memorial. It stood in the village square, a simple stone marker with a bronze plaque. The inscription read, "To the heroes of the resistance, who fought in the shadows so that others might live in the light." 1940–1944. Below the general dedication, smaller text listed names: Marie-Claire Fontaine, Henri Dubois, Jean-Pierre Martin, and at the bottom, set apart from the others, Thomas Hartley, American. Sarah stood before the memorial for a long time, thinking about the man who had risked everything for a country that wasn't his own, for people he barely knew. She thought about the courage it must have taken to hide that device in the haystack, to transmit those messages night after night, knowing that each one could be his last. An elderly man approached her, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was weathered by time, his eyes clouded by cataracts, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested a mind still fully engaged with the world. "You're here about the American," he said in French. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "Did you know him?" The old man was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. "I was 12 years old when the Germans came. My father was in the resistance. He worked with Thomas, helped him with his mission." "What do you remember about him?" "Everything." The old man smiled, a sad, distant expression. He was tall for an American, though not as tall as the Germans. He had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that saw everything but judged nothing. And he was brave, so very brave. "Tell me," Sarah said. The old man took a deep breath, and then he began to speak. "It was August of 43. I didn't know what my father was doing, of course. Children weren't told such things. But I knew something was happening. I could see it in the way the adults whispered, in the tension that filled the air whenever a German patrol passed by." He paused, gathering his memories. "One night I couldn't sleep. It was hot, terribly hot, and I had gone to the window for fresh air. That's when I saw him. Thomas. He was moving through the darkness like a shadow, heading toward the haystack that stood near the German barn." "Did you tell anyone?" "My father, the next morning. I was scared. Thought perhaps I had seen a ghost or a German spy. But my father just smiled and told me to forget what I had seen. Some things," he said, "are too important to remember." The old man fell silent, lost in his memories. "What happened to your father?" Sarah asked gently. "He survived the war, barely. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 44, just weeks before the liberation. They tortured him, trying to get him to reveal the names of other resistance members. But he never talked, not once. And he never told you about Thomas's mission. Not until years later, when I was a grown man with children of my own. That's when he finally told me the whole story. About the listening device, about the intelligence that Thomas had gathered, about how that information had helped the Allies plan the invasion." The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a piece of metal, tarnished by time, but still recognizable. A fragment of copper wire, twisted and bent. "My father found this in the haystack after the war. It was part of the antenna that Thomas had used to boost the signal from his device. He kept it as a memento, a reminder of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat." He pressed the fragment into Sarah's hand. "Take it. Tell his story. Make sure the world remembers what Thomas Hartley did." Sarah looked down at the piece of wire, feeling its weight in her palm. It was such a small thing, so insignificant in appearance, but it represented something enormous, the courage of a man who had risked everything for freedom. "I will," she promised. "I will." The documentary that Sarah produced aired on the anniversary of D-Day, 75 years after the Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. It told Thomas's story in full, using interviews, historical footage, and dramatic recreations to bring the past to life. The response was overwhelming. Veterans and their families reached out to express their gratitude. Historians praised the film for its accuracy and emotional power. And in France, the village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire became a destination for those who wanted to walk in Thomas's footsteps, to see the place where one man had made such an extraordinary difference. But the most meaningful response came from Thomas's own family. His grandson, now a professor of history at Yale, had watched the documentary with tears streaming down his face. He had always known that his grandfather was a veteran, had always sensed that there was more to his story than the sanitized versions he had heard as a child. But he had never imagined anything like this. "He never talked about it," the grandson said in an interview after the film aired. "Not once. I asked him about the war when I was a teenager, and he just smiled and said that some stories weren't meant to be told. I always thought he meant that the war had been too painful to discuss. Now I understand that he was protecting us, protecting the people who had helped him." "What do you think his legacy is?" the interviewer asked. The grandson thought for a long moment before responding. "Courage," he said finally. "Not the loud, obvious kind of courage that gets medals and parades. The quiet kind. The kind that gets up every morning knowing that this might be the day everything falls apart and does the job anyway. That's what my grandfather taught me, even if he never said it in words. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. In the village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire, a new addition was made to the memorial in the square. Beside the bronze plaque listing the names of the resistance heroes, a new marker was installed. It showed an image of a haystack, simple and unremarkable, and beneath it an inscription. In this village, in the summer of 1943, a listening device hidden in a haystack helped change the course of history. This marker is dedicated to Thomas Hartley and all those who fought in the shadows, whose courage and sacrifice made victory possible. Visitors to the village often stop at the memorial, reading the inscription, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live through those terrible, heroic years. Some leave flowers, some leave small American flags, and some simply stand in silence, paying tribute to a man they never knew, but whose actions had touched their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The haystack is gone, of course. It rotted away decades ago, its contents scattered by wind and rain and the passage of time. But the story lives on, passed from generation to generation, a testament to the power of one person to make a difference. Thomas Hartley wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy. He was just an engineer from Detroit who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time and decided to do something about it. He saw an opportunity that others might have missed, and he seized it with both hands, knowing that failure meant death, but refusing to let that stop him. That's the real lesson of the bug in the haystack. Not that one person can change history, though that's certainly true, but that the choice to act, to resist, to fight for what's right, is always available to us. We might not have the chance to steal intelligence from a Panzer division, but we all face moments when we must decide whether to stand up or stand aside, whether to act or to accept. Thomas chose to act, and because he did, thousands of young men who might have died on the beaches of Normandy lived to see their children and grandchildren. Because he did, the war ended sooner than it might have otherwise. Because he did, the world we live in today is a little bit better, a little bit freer, a little bit more hopeful. That's a legacy worth remembering. That's a story worth telling. And that's why, even now, even decades after the war ended and the last veterans have passed away, we continue to honor the memory of those who served. Not because they were perfect, not because they were superhuman, but because they were ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the moment demanded it. The tough guy who hid a bug in a haystack was one of them. His name was Thomas Hartley, and his story, like the stories of all those who fought for freedom, deserves to be remembered. So the next time you pass a haystack, or see a documentary about World War II, or visit a memorial to the fallen, take a moment to think about Thomas. Think about the choices he made, the risks he took, the price he was willing to pay for freedom. And then ask yourself, what would you do if you were in his position? Would you have the courage to act? Would you be willing to risk everything for something bigger than yourself? These are questions worth asking. These are lessons worth learning, because the war may be over, but the struggle for freedom never ends. And in every generation, there are those who must choose whether to stand up or stand aside, whether to fight or to flee. Thomas Hartley made his choice. He stood up. He fought. And because he did, the world is a better place. That's the power of one person in the right place, at the right time, with the courage to do what needs to be done. That's the story of the bug in the haystack, and that, dear viewer, is where our story ends. But remember, every ending is also a beginning. The courage that Thomas showed, the determination that drove him, the belief that one person can make a difference, these things don't die when the last veteran passes away. They live on, in the choices we make, in the values we uphold, in the legacy we leave behind. So take inspiration from Thomas Hartley, take inspiration from Marie Claire and Henri, and all the others who risked everything for freedom. And when your moment comes, when you're faced with a choice between safety and sacrifice, between comfort and courage, remember what they did. Remember the bug in the haystack, and choose wisely. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think about what truly matters in life, then please share it with someone you love. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered, deserve to be passed on, deserve to inspire future generations to stand up for what's right. This has been the story of Thomas Hartley, the tough guy who hid a bug in a haystack and stole intel from an entire Panzer division. This has been a story of courage, of sacrifice, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And this has been a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when all hope seems lost, one person can still make all the difference in the world. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never forget the lessons of history. Because those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it, and those who remember it have the power to build a better future. Goodbye for now. And thank you for being part of this journey through history. The night before Thomas had planted the bug in the haystack, he had written a letter to his mother back in Detroit. He never sent it, knowing that any correspondence from occupied France would be intercepted and read by German censors, but he kept it, folded carefully in his breast pocket, a talisman against the darkness that surrounded him. The letter was found among his effects after his death, yellowed with age but still legible. His grandson read it aloud at the funeral, his voice breaking with emotion. "Dear mother, by the time you read this, I will either be a hero or a fool, perhaps both. I have been given an opportunity to do something that might help end this terrible war, something that might save lives and bring our boys home sooner. I cannot tell you what it is, only that it is dangerous and that I am afraid. But I am more afraid of doing nothing, of watching from the sidelines while good people suffer and die. You raised me to believe that one person can make a difference, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. Tonight, I will find out if I truly believe those words. Whatever happens, know that I love you, that I am proud to be your son, and that I have tried to live my life in a way that would make you proud. Your loving son, Thomas." Those words, written in the shadow of mortal danger, capture something essential about who Thomas Hartley was and what he believed. He was not a man who sought glory or recognition. He was simply a man who saw an opportunity to do good and refused to let fear stop him from taking it. That is perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from his story. Not that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary people, but that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, have the capacity to rise to the occasion. Thomas Hartley was proof of that. Marie Claire was proof of that. The countless men and women of the resistance who fought and died in the shadows were proof of that. And we, the inheritors of their sacrifice, have a responsibility to remember what they did, to honor their memory, and to carry forward the values for which they fought. The bug in the haystack was just a small device, a piece of electronics no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, but it represented something much larger, the refusal to accept tyranny, the determination to fight back against oppression, the belief that even in the darkest times, hope endures. Thomas Hartley understood that. And now, perhaps, so do you. The war is over. The battles have been fought and won. But the struggle for freedom continues, in new forms and in new places, wherever people refuse to accept injustice and choose instead to stand up for what is right. May we all have the courage to make that choice when our moment comes. May we all be worthy of the legacy that Thomas Hartley and his generation left behind. And may we never forget the tough guy who hid a bug in a haystack and changed the course of history.